Imagine waking up one morning to find the sun never truly rises, just a dim, hazy glow behind thick clouds that refuse to part. Day after day, the cold lingers. Crops wither in the fields, livestock starve, and whispers of desperation spread through villages as hunger tightens its grip. This wasn't the plot of a dystopian novel. It was real life in early England, where a mysterious and devastating weather event brought society to the brink of collapse. For years, the skies remained ominously dark, temperatures plummeted, and harvests failed. What caused this environmental catastrophe? How did entire communities survive when nature itself seemed to turn against them? And why does this ancient crisis still matter to us today? The story we're about to unravel isn't just a tale of survival. It's a window into humanity's resilience in the face of the unimaginable. Centuries ago, long before modern science could explain such disasters, the people of early England faced a climate crisis so severe it reshaped their world. Some historians believe it may have been triggered by a massive volcanic eruption halfway across the globe, spewing ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, blotting out the sun. Others point to dramatic shifts in ocean currents or even cosmic events. But one thing is certain: the consequences were dire, villages emptied, traditions vanished. And the very fabric of daily life unraveled as people scrambled to adapt or perish. Yet within this darkness lies a story of ingenuity and hope. Against all odds, survivors found ways to endure, foraging new foods, altering their farming practices, and leaning on communal bonds stronger than the cold. Their struggles echo eerily in our own era of climate uncertainty, offering lessons about fragility, adaptation, and the unbreakable human spirit. So join me as we step back into this nearly forgotten chapter of history, where the weather didn't just change the forecast, it changed the course of civilization. By the end of this journey, you'll see early England and our own modern world in a whole new light. The skies over England in the mid-6th century weren't just gloomy, they were apocalyptic. For nearly a decade, the sun struggled to penetrate a suffocating veil of ash and dust, casting the land into perpetual twilight. Contemporary chroniclers wrote of summers that never warmed, winters that refused to end, and crops that rotted in the damp, frigid soil. One Welsh monk lamented that bread had vanished from the land, forcing people to survive on roots and scavenged nuts. Modern science has given us chilling clues about what unfolded. Ice cores drilled from Greenland's glaciers reveal layers of sulfuric acid dating to the year 536, a telltale fingerprint of a volcanic cataclysm powerful enough to alter global weather patterns. Tree rings from ancient oaks show stunted growth for over 15 years, as if the trees themselves were gasping for sunlight. But this wasn't just bad weather, it was a cascading disaster. With harvests failing year after year, grain stores emptied, and famine spread like wildfire. Archaeological digs across Britain uncover mass graves from this period, where skeletal remains show signs of chronic malnutrition and even cannibalism as desperation took hold. Trade networks collapsed when there was nothing left to barter, isolating villages that had once thrived on commerce. The political consequences were equally devastating. Kingdoms weakened by starvation became easy prey for invaders, while tribal leaders lost legitimacy when their prayers for relief went unanswered. Some scholars believe this crisis may have accelerated the collapse of post-Roman British societies, creating a power vacuum that allowed anglo-saxon warlords to expand their territories unchecked. What makes this event so haunting is how suddenly it struck and how long its shadow lingered. Unlike droughts or floods that might last a single growing season, This was a climatic siege that stretched across generations. Farmers who had spent lifetimes mastering their craft watched helplessly as traditional planting cycles became useless. Entire villages were abandoned as people migrated in search of food, leaving behind empty halls where hearth fires had once burned bright. The oral traditions of Wales and Ireland preserve eerie echoes of this trauma, with legends of a speckled mist that blighted the land and heroes who ventured into otherworldly realms to restore the sun. Even the great monasteries, repositories of knowledge and stability, saw their scribes record increasingly dire prophecies as the darkness persisted. Yet amid this devastation, glimmers of human adaptability shine through. In the absence of wheat, people turned to hardier crops like barley and rye. Coastal communities increased their reliance on fishing when farmland failed. Some archaeological sites show evidence of experimental farming techniques, early attempts at crop rotation or drainage systems to combat waterlogged fields. The crisis even spurred technological innovation, with blacksmiths developing more efficient tools to maximize dwindling resources. These scattered fragments of resilience remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the drive to survive sparks creativity. As we face our own era of climate uncertainty, the forgotten catastrophe of 6th century England stands as both a warning and a testament to the indomitable spirit that carried civilizations through their greatest trials. Before the skies darkened and the cold took hold, early medieval England was a land tethered to the rhythms of nature. Villages dotted the countryside like scattered seeds, small, self-sufficient communities where life revolved around the soil. Farmers tracked the turning seasons with sacred precision, planting barley and wheat in spring, tending flocks through summer, and praying their harvests would last the long winter. The margin between survival and starvation was razor thin. A single failed crop could mean hardship, while 2 or 3 barren years could unravel an entire settlement. Homes were simple wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs, their floors often shared with livestock for warmth. The air would have smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and the yeasty tang of brewing ale, the one small luxury in a life of relentless toil. Politically, this was a fractured world of petty kingdoms and tribal loyalties, where power shifted like the wind. Post-Roman Britain had splintered into realms ruled by warlords and chieftains, figures like the legendary King Arthur, whose myths may echo real leaders struggling to hold their people together. Christianity, still new to these shores, coexisted uneasily with older pagan traditions. Monasteries served as islands of learning amid the turbulence, their scribes meticulously copying texts by candlelight, while beyond their walls, oral traditions kept alive the stories of ancestors. Trade connected distant communities with iron, salt, and pottery, moving along muddy tracks and winding rivers. But these networks were fragile, easily severed by conflict or, as would soon become devastatingly clear, by forces far beyond human control. What made these societies so vulnerable wasn't just their reliance on the land. It was the sheer scale of what they didn't know. Without understanding atmospheric science or global climate patterns, they interpreted environmental changes through the lens of omens and divine wrath. A sudden frost or unseasonal rain might be seen as a warning from the gods, prompting sacrifices or prayers. Local rulers derived their authority from the belief they could intercede with these forces, a dangerous bargain when nature refused to cooperate. The very rituals meant to ensure good harvests, from blessing plows to dancing for rain, reveal a world acutely aware of its precariousness. When the disaster came, it didn't just test their physical resilience, it shattered their understanding of how the universe worked. Yet within that fragility lay unnoticed strengths. Communities were bound by deep interdependence, neighbors shared tools, food, and labor in ways that modern individualism might struggle to comprehend. The same oral traditions that framed disasters as supernatural also preserved generations of practical wisdom: which plants could stave off hunger, how to store grain against dampness, when to move livestock to higher ground. These were people adept at reading subtle signs in their environment, from the flight patterns of birds to the taste of the wind. Such skills, honed over lifetimes, would soon mean the difference between extinction and survival. As we'll see, when the unimaginable cold descended, it wasn't just strength that saved them. It was their ability to adapt, to learn, and to cling together in the gathering dark. At first, the changes were subtle: a frost that lingered too long into spring, a summer that never quite warmed, an autumn harvest that yielded less than expected. Farmers exchanging worried glances might have chalked it up to bad luck, a passing hardship to endure, but the seasons didn't right themselves. Winter storms arrived earlier, harsher, stripping bark from trees and freezing rivers solid for months. Springs that should have brought tender shoots and birdsong instead delivered only damp, unyielding cold. Chronicles from monasteries tell of monks shivering in their cloisters, their ink freezing in pots as they recorded the strangeness. Words like sunless and barren creeping into their accounts with growing alarm. The land itself bore silent witness. Oak trees, normally robust, produced rings so narrow they nearly vanished, a stark testament to years when sunlight barely reached the forest floor. In Ireland, scribes wrote of a bread failure so severe it sparked panic in kingdoms accustomed to plenty. Across the North Sea, Scandinavian sagas described a dim, copper-colored sun that gave no warmth, while Byzantine historians half a world away noted strange hazes darkening the skies. These weren't isolated misfortunes, but threads of a single, terrifying tapestry. What made these early warnings so chilling was how they defied explanation. In an era without weather forecasts or climate models, people grasped for meaning in the only terms they understood: divine displeasure, celestial omens, the unraveling of natural order. Rituals intensified, offerings were made at stone circles, prayers chanted with renewed urgency. Yet the cold persisted. Sheep died in fields where grass refused to grow. Fruit withered on branches before ripening, and as food stores dwindled, so too did patience. Whispers of blame turned neighbor against neighbor, king against priest. The cruelest twist: some communities might have survived a single disastrous year, but when the cold became a relentless guest, outstaying its welcome season after season, resilience itself began to fracture. Farmers who had spent generations mastering their land now watched helplessly as ancestral knowledge failed them. The very predictability of life, the certainty that sowing would lead to reaping, crumbled like frostbitten grain. By the time the full scale of the catastrophe became undeniable, it was too late to prevent the hunger, the migrations, the desperate choices that would redefine an era. Those first uneasy years of odd weather weren't just a prelude, they were the first strokes of a brush painting a world undone. The darkest chapter came when the sun itself seemed to give up. For 18 relentless months beginning in the year 536, daylight became a memory. Chronicles from across Europe describe a sun that shone like the moon, a pale, weak, and utterly devoid of warmth. Irish monks scribbled frantic notes about a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539, while Byzantine historian Procopius recorded something even more chilling. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during an eclipse. This wasn't mere winter, it was as if the seasons had abandoned the world entirely. Scientists now believe a colossal volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland or Central America, was the culprit. The explosion would have hurled millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, forming a veil that scattered sunlight back into space. Ice cores from Greenland show sulfate deposits from this period nearly 3 times higher than those left by Krakatoa's infamous 1883 eruption. The effect was a climate nightmare. Global temperatures likely dropped by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, enough to disrupt growing seasons across continents. In England, where even a mild summer meant the difference between plenty and want, the impact was catastrophic. Starvation became the defining horror of the age. Welsh poetry from the era speaks of families boiling leather belts for broth, of parents abandoning infants they could no longer feed. Archaeologists excavating 6th century settlements find layers of soil unusually rich in weed seeds, evidence of people foraging desperately for anything edible when grain stores ran out. One Anglo-Saxon riddle preserved in a later manuscript paints a grim picture. I saw creatures, foodless and friendless, gnawing the dead. These weren't metaphors. Skeletal remains from mass graves show teeth marks on bones, stark proof of cannibalism when all other options vanished. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Imagine living in perpetual twilight, your breath visible even in what should have been midsummer, watching your children grow thinner with each passing moon. Without understanding atmospheric science, people turn to supernatural explanation sermons from the time blame humanity's sins for provoking divine wrath. In Ireland, the chronicle known as the Annals of Ulster records a comet of unusual size, seen just before the disaster, while Scandinavian sagas later wove the event into myths of Fimbulwinter, the apocalyptic winter foretelling Ragnarök. Even the landscape seemed to grieve. Pollen studies show a dramatic decline in cultivated crops, replaced by hardy weeds and ferns reclaiming abandoned fields. Yet what makes this period so haunting isn't just the suffering, it's how it reshaped society. Kingdoms reliant on agricultural surplus saw their power crumble as starving armies disbanded and tax collectors found nothing to take. Trade routes withered when merchants had no goods to move. The crisis may have accelerated the Anglo-Saxon takeover of Britain, as weakened Celtic rulers fell to invaders better adapted to harsh conditions. But it also forged unexpected resilience. Some communities banded together, pooling dwindling resources in shared, famine pits, where communal ovens baked whatever meager harvests could be gathered. Others turned to the sea with renewed intensity, as fish bones in inland trash heaps suddenly give way to layers of shellfish, a sign of coastal foraging spreading far inland. The quiet heroism of everyday survival shines through the cracks of this broken world. A single barley seed found in a 6th century storage pit, charred but intact, tells a story of someone scraping together a last desperate planting. A repaired plowshare discovered in Norfolk shows blacksmiths laboring to mend tools rather than forge weapons. These small acts of stubborn hope, more than any king's decree or warrior's sword, carried England through its long night. As we face our own climate uncertainties today, their ordeal reminds us that catastrophe reveals not just vulnerability, but the tenacity of communities refusing to vanish into the dark. The hunger began as a gnawing emptiness, then grew into something monstrous. In villages across England, families faced impossible choices: stay and starve, or abandon generations of roots in search of food. Footpaths once trod by traders became trails of exodus, littered with the belongings too heavy to carry. Broken loom weights, cracked pottery, even heirlooms left beside the road. Archaeologists find these silent testaments in clusters, marking where entire communities simply walked away. Some never made it further than the edge of their fields. Mass graves unearthed near York and Cambridgeshire tell horrifying stories through bones. Adults with the telltale horizontal grooves in their teeth called Harris lines, evidence of childhood starvation followed by brief recovery, only to face famine again as grown men and women. Children's skeletons show stunted growth, their limbs too short for their age. The most chilling finds are bones bearing knife marks not from butchering animals but from defleshing human remains. These aren't the orderly cuts of ritual burial, but the jagged scrapes of desperation. Rumors of cannibalism weren't just dark folklore. A Welsh chronicle from the time recounts a man discovered eating stolen human flesh. His defense, a single, devastating question: what mother wouldn't feed her child? The legal codes of King Inge of Wessex, written decades later, still carried eerie echoes of the crisis, specific penalties for stealing bread or hoarding grain, crimes that had once been unthinkable. Societal bonds unraveled like frayed rope. Where neighbors once shared harvests, distrust took root. Excavations at abandoned villages reveal hasty burials inside homes, suggesting people died alone as others fled. In one Somerset settlement, a single intact loom was found surrounded by scattered spindle walls, as if women had dropped their weaving mid-stitch. The archaeological record grows sparse for these years. Few new buildings, no ornate jewelry, just the barest scraps of survival. Even the pottery changes, becoming cruder and thinner as skilled potters likely starved or turned to other tasks. Yet within this darkness glimmer fragments of compassion. At a site in East Anglia, archaeologists uncovered a small pit containing the skeletons of an elderly woman and a child, carefully arranged with their hands clasped. Soil analysis revealed traces of wildflowers placed with them, a heartbreaking gesture of care in a world gone merciless. Other graves show evidence of shared suffering, mass burials where the young and old lie side by side, their bodies positioned with what dignity remained. The famine didn't just claim lives, it rewrote cultural DNA. Oral traditions from Cornwall to Northumbria tell of the forgetting time when songs and stories died with their keepers. Languages may have shifted as starving populations migrated, blending dialects under the pressure of necessity. The very way people worship changed. Pagan amulets and Christian crosses are found mingled in the same layers of soil, suggesting desperation made theological pragmatists of everyone. What emerges from the dirt isn't just a record of loss, but a map of human extremes. For every account of brutality, there's evidence of sacrifice: parents going hungry so children might live another week, strangers sharing last handfuls of grain. The famine tested not just bodies but the soul of a society, revealing how thin the veneer of civilization can become when the sun refuses to shine. Yet even at the brink, people held fast to flickers of humanity, planting seeds both literal and metaphorical that would eventually grow again. The stability of early English kingdoms relied on a delicate balance: enough food to feed warriors, enough wealth to reward loyalty, and enough divine favor to justify a ruler's authority. When the weather catastrophe struck, it didn't just wither crops, it shattered this fragile equilibrium. Within years, once mighty halls stood empty, their timber frames rotting under endless rains. Kings who had commanded feasts now presided over hollow-cheeked retinues, their power leaching away like warmth from the soil. Archaeology paints a stark picture of this collapse. At the royal site of Yeavering in Northumbria, where King Edwin once held court, the great timber amphitheatre built for assemblies shows signs of abrupt abandonment. Post holes meant for grand structures are left half-dug, as if workers simply dropped their tools mid-task. Similar scenes unfold across Britain: fortifications left unmanned, boundary ditches unfinished. The message is clear: when survival became uncertain, even the symbols of authority lost their hold. scarcity bred violence on an unprecedented scale. Old rivalries between kingdoms flared into desperate raids, not for glory but for sacks of mouldering grain. A Welsh chronicle records the sacking of a monastery, not by pagan invaders, but by starving Christians who stripped its stores of dried fish and lentils. Law codes from the period reveal a grim shift. Penalties for cattle theft, once a routine dispute, now carried death sentences, reflecting how vital livestock had become. Even burial customs changed. Warriors were increasingly interred with weapons in hand, a silent testament to rising tensions. The crisis exposed a brutal truth: legitimacy was tied to prosperity. Rulers who couldn't deliver food saw their authority crumble. In Kent, King Eärmenric's once loyal thanes reportedly abandoned him to seek service with Mercian lords rumored to have better stocked granaries. Oral traditions from the Scottish borders tell of a petty king who offered his crown to any druid or priest who could make the sun remember its name. When no miracle came, his people dispersed into the hills, becoming the ancestors of later nomadic clans. Yet the greatest upheaval came not from thrones, but from the movement of ordinary people. Starvation triggered migrations that redrew cultural maps. Entire villages packed onto ox carts, following rumors of fertile valleys or less ravaged coasts. Place name studies reveal these desperate journeys. Settlements ending in ingas, denoting kinship groups, suddenly appear far from their ancestral lands. DNA analysis of remains shows surprising genetic mixing in this period, suggesting survival sometimes meant assimilating with strangers. Some kingdoms adapted better than others. The Anglo-Saxons, with their mixed farming and herding traditions, proved more resilient than Celtic realms dependent on single-crop agriculture. This may explain their eventual dominance, not through conquest alone, but by filling voids left by collapsing societies. Excavations show Saxon settlements expanding into abandoned British territories, not with fire and sword, but with carefully tended vegetable plots and sturdy longhouses designed for harsh winters. The true legacy of this collapse wasn't just political, it was psychological. A generation raised in perpetual hunger carried its scars forward. Later laws revealed deep-seated fears, strict penalties for hoarding, elaborate systems for food distribution, even protocols for welcoming starving strangers. The crisis birthed a cultural memory so potent it echoed for centuries in Beowulf's descriptions of mead halls standing against the darkness, in folk tales of heroes bargaining with spirits for spring's return. When later scribes wrote of kings proving their worth by feeding the land, they weren't speaking metaphorically. They were remembering a time when leadership meant keeping death at bay one more season, and when the measure of a civilization wasn't its gold but its granaries. When the skies refused to brighten and the earth turned barren, people didn't just hunger for bread, they hungered for meaning. In a world where science couldn't explain climate shifts, the unrelenting darkness seemed like a message from the divine. Monasteries across Britain recorded eerie signs: crosses glowing with unnatural light, wells bubbling with black water, flocks of birds flying westward as if fleeing doom. These weren't mere observations, they were desperate attempts to decode catastrophe. A Welsh chronicle tells of priests holding vigils where they chanted psalms backward, a forbidden practice meant to reverse whatever cosmic imbalance had stolen the sun. Pagan communities saw omens in every shadow. Farmers reported hearing disembodied plows scraping fields at night, while fishermen spoke of spectral lights hovering over lakes, old folkloric warnings of nature's displeasure. Archaeologists have uncovered charms buried in doorways from this era, twisted iron rods shaped like serpents, meant to ward off malevolent forces. At Sutton Hoo, a ceremonial whetstone was found carved with faces contorted in anguish, possibly representing deities imagined to be withholding warmth. Even the landscape itself became a canvas for fear. Standing stones once aligned with solstices now stood as mocking reminders of seasons that no longer turned. Christian and pagan beliefs collided in unexpected ways under the weight of shared suffering. In Kent, a bishop ordered the relics of Saint Augustine paraded through withered fields, while just miles away, villagers whispered that the frost giants of Norse myth had broken free from their icy prisons. A fragmentary manuscript from Cornwall describes a hybrid ritual where priests sprinkled holy water over stone circles, while elders chanted rhymes to melt the grip of the frost witch. This syncretism wasn't heresy, it was pragmatism. When prayers to one god went unanswered, people hedged their bets. The crisis birthed new legends that lingered for centuries. Irish monks wrote of the lean years when spectral horsemen rode through mist gathering souls of the starved. An old English poem, The Ruin, describes crumbling halls where giants' work once stood, a possible allusion to the abandoned Roman buildings repurposed as famine shelters. Most haunting is the tale of the Green Children, later recorded in medieval chronicles. Two emaciated siblings said to have emerged from a cave, speaking an unknown language, their skin tinged green from living on nothing but wild plants. Folklorists now suspect this myth originated as a distorted memory of refugees from the worst-hit regions. Yet amid the terror, faith also offered solace. In Lindisfarne, monks meticulously copied psalms about divine mercy, even as their hands shook from hunger. Excavations at Whitby Abbey reveal a surprising surge in burials with simple crosses carved into coffins not just for clergy, but for peasants granted sacred rights in death they might never have received in life. The disaster didn't just test belief, it distilled it. When the old gods and new alike seemed silent, people crafted their own answers. A single surviving homily from the period puts it plainly: if heaven withholds its light, we must become the sparks. What emerged from this spiritual turmoil was a transformed religious landscape. The crisis weakened rigid dogma, making room for folk practices that blended Christianity with older traditions. Saints' feast days began coinciding with pagan agricultural festivals, ensuring no celestial advocate was overlooked. Even the concept of penance evolved. Fasting, once a voluntary act of piety, became a grim necessity, reshaping how people understood sacrifice. These adaptations reveal humanity's deepest instinct. When faced with the inexplicable, we don't just pray for deliverance, we rewrite the prayers themselves. Centuries after the skies finally cleared, modern science began piecing together what early medieval chroniclers could only describe as divine wrath. The first clue came from Greenland's ice sheets, layers of ancient snow preserving chemical fingerprints of the past. Deep within cores drilled from these frozen archives, researchers found a startling spike in sulfuric acid dating precisely to the year 536. This wasn't just a local anomaly. Similar signals appeared in Antarctic ice, confirming a global atmospheric event. The culprit, a volcanic eruption of staggering magnitude, possibly 50 times more explosive than Mount St. Helens, spewing ash and sulfur dioxide high enough to encircle the planet. Tree rings from Ireland to Siberia tell the same story. For over 15 years after the eruption, growth nearly halted as trees starved for sunlight. But where did this volcano erupt? Here, the evidence fractures like the Earth itself. Some scientists point to Ilopango in El Salvador, whose massive caldera matches the timeline. Others argue for an Indonesian candidate like Krakatoa's ancient ancestor, citing ash layers in ocean sediments. The most compelling case may lie in Iceland, where volcanic glass fragments found in European peat bogs suggest an eruption so violent it scattered debris across continents. What's undeniable is the aftermath: sulfur particles reflecting sunlight back into space. triggering a volcanic winter that dropped global temperatures by up to 3 degrees Celsius. Climate models simulating this scenario show chilling parallels to historical accounts: disrupted monsoon cycles in Asia, failed harvests in Europe, and the prolonged dimming of the sun described by Byzantine scribes. Yet volcanoes aren't the only suspect. Another theory points to a cosmic culprit: a swarm of comet fragments slamming into Earth's atmosphere. Chinese astronomers recorded an unusual hanging star in 536, while Irish chronicles mention a comet of unusual size. When researchers examined ice cores for extraterrestrial dust, they found elevated platinum levels around the same period, a potential signature of space debris. However, the lack of widespread impact craters makes this hypothesis contentious. More plausible is a perfect storm scenario: a weakened sun during a centuries-long solar minimum coinciding with volcanic activity, amplifying the cooling effect. The most fascinating evidence comes from an unexpected source: ocean sediment. Core samples from the North Atlantic show sudden changes in current patterns around the 6th century, possibly triggered by freshwater influx from melting glaciers. This could have disrupted the Gulf Stream, the oceanic conveyor belt that keeps Europe temperate. Imagine the catastrophe: multiplying ash clouds cooling the atmosphere while faltering currents lock the cold in place. It's no wonder the suffering lasted generations. What makes this detective work so vital isn't just solving an ancient mystery, it's understanding how interconnected our world truly is. A single eruption or cosmic event can ripple across continents, toppling civilizations in its wake. As modern climate science grapples with human-induced changes, the catastrophe of 536 stands as a stark reminder: when nature shifts its balance, no society is immune. The voices of those who endured their prayers carved into monastery walls, their bones cradled in the earth, whisper a warning across the centuries. Their long winter began with forces beyond their control. Ours, we still have power to change. Volcanic eruptions capable of altering global climate don't come from just any mountain. They require a cataclysm of almost unimaginable scale. Among the prime suspects for the 6th century disaster is Iceland's Eldgjá, a fissure system stretching 40 kilometers across the island's fiery landscape. When Eldgjá erupted around the year 939, medieval chronicles described lava flows so immense they could have buried entire counties. But tree ring and ice core evidence suggests an even earlier event, perhaps an eruption so colossal it makes Eldgjá look tame by comparison. Then there's Ilopango in modern El Salvador, whose caldera spans 17 kilometers of scarred earth. When this volcano exploded in the mid-6th century, it ejected enough debris to blanket Central America in ash layers 3 feet thick. The blast's thermal fingerprints show up in Mayan records as a time of no sun, coinciding eerily with European accounts. But the most compelling evidence comes from sulfur isotopes in Greenland's ice, chemical signatures that point toward the tropics, narrowing the search to volcanoes like Ilopango or perhaps Indonesia's Krakatoa, whose ancestor may have detonated around the same era. What made these eruptions so globally devastating wasn't just their violence, it was the altitude they reached. While typical volcanic plumes top out at 15 kilometers, super eruptions can punch through the stratosphere, lofting sulfur dioxide 30 kilometers up. At that height, winds spread the particles across hemispheres within weeks, forming a reflective veil that lingers for years. Ice cores reveal the 636 event injected an estimated 200 megatons of sulfur into the atmosphere, enough to dim sunlight by 20% globally. The real horror lies in the chain reaction these particles triggered. As sunlight faded, land surfaces cooled faster than oceans, disrupting the convection cycles that drive rainfall. Monsoons faltered across Asia, while Europe's weather patterns went haywire. Unseasonable frosts in July, snows in September. Dendrochronologists studying Irish oaks found that 536 was the coldest summer in 2,000 years, with temperatures plunging 3 degrees Celsius below average. Yet the most insidious effect was the duration. Unlike single-year events like Tambora's 1815 eruption, which caused Europe's infamous year without a summer, the 6th century disaster dragged on for over a decade. Sulfate aerosols don't simply rain out, they linger, replenished by atmospheric circulation. Climate models simulating these conditions show how successive years of cooling could have collapsed agricultural systems, first killing sensitive crops like wheat, then hardier barley, until even forage plants failed. This wasn't just bad weather, it was climate change in fast forward. The parallels to modern global warming are haunting. Just as greenhouse gases trap heat today, volcanic aerosols back then reflected it away, flipping the planet's thermostat into a dangerous new state. The difference: our ancestors had no warning, no science to explain why their world was unraveling. When Norse legends spoke of Fimbulwinter, 3 winters without summer, they weren't spinning myths. They were preserving trauma. The final chilling lesson comes from how far the damage spread. Antarctic ice cores contained sulfate spikes matching Greenland's, proving this was no local catastrophe. Chinese records tell of yellow snow and summer frosts, while Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a sun that gave no light, as if in perpetual eclipse. Even the Maya, shielded by distance from Eurasia's worst suffering, recorded famines and political collapse. Nature's fury knew no borders, only victims. What emerges isn't just the story of a volcano, but a warning written in ash and ice. When Earth systems tilt out of balance, whether by natural forces or human hands, the consequences ripple farther and last longer than we dare imagine. The survivors of 536 left no climate models or satellite data, only bones, stories, and a silent plea across the centuries: heed the skies. When the familiar rhythms of farming collapsed under endless winters, survival demanded radical reinvention. Communities that had relied on wheat and barley for generations suddenly found these staples failing year after year. But in the layers of 6th century rubbish pits, archaeologists uncover something remarkable: seeds of plants, once considered weeds or famine foods, now taking center stage. Nettle leaves, acorns, and even fern roots appear in grinding stones, their bitterness no match for the gnawing hunger. Coastal settlements tell a similar story through shifting bone piles. Fish remains grow more numerous, but also smaller, as desperate fishermen depleted near-shore stocks and ventured farther out in fragile boats. One of the most striking adaptations was the sudden importance of rye. Previously a secondary crop, this hardy grain thrived where others withered, its deep roots tapping into colder soils. Excavations across England show rye pollen spiking in layers corresponding to the worst famine years. While wheat all but vanishes, people weren't just surviving, they were relearning agriculture from scratch. At West Stow in Suffolk, post holes reveal hastily built grain storage huts elevated on stilts, a clever defense against rodents drawn to scarce supplies. Other sites yield crude but effective innovations: woven baskets lined with clay to store damp-proofed grain, or pits layered with charcoal and straw to inhibit mold. The crisis reshaped even the most intimate domestic routines. Analysis of cooking pots from this period shows a dramatic increase in boiling over roasting, not just for tenderizing tough foraged greens, but because stews stretched meager ingredients further. At a dig in Yorkshire, researchers found a single hearth containing charred remains of over 30 plant species, from dock seeds to birch bark, evidence of relentless experimentation. Perhaps most poignant are the famine bread fragments preserved in some sites, mixes of ground nutshells, dried berries, and whatever scant grain could be spared, baked into dense loaves that would have been barely digestible. Metalwork tells its own tale of adaptation. Blacksmiths, once prized for crafting weapons, now redirected skills toward survival. Hoards from the period contained disproportionate numbers of sickles and scythes, their blades worn thin from harvesting every possible shoot. At a workshop in Kent, archaeologists uncovered dozens of half-finished plough shares modified with extra iron tips, a desperate attempt to eke more seasons from failing tools. Even personal ornaments changed. Bronze brooches grew simpler as artisans conserved materials, while some graves contained necklaces strung with animal teeth and fish vertebrae, beauty born of necessity. Perhaps the most profound shift was social. Law codes from the time show new emphasis on communal responsibility, strict penalties for hoarding, elaborate systems for redistributing food stores. At the monastery of Jarrow, records describe monks tearing down portions of their own cloister to build shelters for starving families, while in Wales, poetry praises chieftains who slaughtered their prized herds to feed followers. This collective spirit left physical traces too. Boundary ditches between farms disappear in some regions, suggesting fields were merged to pool labor and resources. The true measure of these adaptations lies not just in their ingenuity, but in their legacy. Many changes outlasted the crisis. Rye became a staple crop in colder regions. Elevated granaries remained standard, and communal land management laid groundwork for medieval farming systems. What began as emergency measures became cultural inheritance, proving humanity's greatest skill isn't just enduring disaster, but weaving survival into the fabric of daily life. When modern climate scientists study these ancient responses, they find not just desperation, but a blueprint for resilience, one where innovation grew from the same soil as despair. Before the skies darkened, trade was the lifeblood of early medieval England, a delicate web of routes connecting coastal ports to inland markets, where iron from the Weald, salt from Cheshire, and pottery from the Thames Valley changed hands. But when famine gripped the land, these networks shattered like brittle winter twigs. The first casualty was luxury goods, amber from the Baltic, glass from Francia vanishing from archaeological layers as merchants stopped risking journeys for non-essentials. Then came the shortages of basics. Smiths ran low on iron for tools. Households reused broken pottery because new shipments never arrived, and worst of all, salt became scarcer than silver. Salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was preservation itself. Without it, meat couldn't be cured for winter, hides spoiled, and malnutrition worsened as iodine vanished from diets. Hoards buried in this period tell a desperate story. Near Hadrian's Wall, a clay pot was found stuffed with 30 Roman-era coins, not hidden by wealth, but abandoned because currency had lost meaning when food couldn't be bought. At Hamwick, once a bustling Saxon marketplace, excavations reveal stalls left mid-transaction, weights for measuring grain still stacked, a merchant's scales tipped over as if their owner fled suddenly. The collapse hit hardest where societies were most specialized. Coastal communities that relied on trading fish for grain starved when inland villages had no surplus to barter. In York, where Frisian traders once hawked fine woolens, soil layers show a sudden shift to coarsely woven local fabrics. Even the prestigious Royal Emporium at London withered. Imported goods dropped by 80% in the archaeological record, replaced by crudely made local imitations. Coin hoards from this era are time capsules of panic. Typically, people buried money during invasions, expecting to reclaim it later. But 5th century hoards contain coins clipped into halves and quarters, evidence of hyperinflation as the value of silver plummeted against loaves of bread. In East Anglia, a cache contained coins from 6 different kingdoms, suggesting frantic attempts to use any currency still accepted. Some hoards include jewelry melted down for bullion, a last-ditch effort to create trade weight when trust in coins evaporated. The psychological impact ran deep. Trading required trust that a promise made in summer would be honored after harvest, that a stranger's word held value. As famine eroded these bonds, societies reverted to hyper-local survival. A poignant example comes from Offa's Dyke, where boundary markers were repositioned to enclose smaller territories not for defense, but to claim every scrap of arable land. The great annual fairs, once hubs of cultural exchange, disappeared for generations. When they eventually revived, transactions were conducted in kind. A bushel of barley for a day's labor, a fleece for an iron knife. Yet in this unraveling, glimmers of adaptability shine. At Santon in Kent, a coastal site abandoned during the worst years shows evidence of later, makeshift fishing camps, proof that some returned to salvage what they could from the sea. In the Midlands, blacksmiths began recycling Roman-era nails scavenged from ruins, forging them into plowshares. The crisis didn't just destroy, it forced innovation, laying groundwork for the more self-sufficient economies of the later Anglo-Saxon period. What emerges from the archaeological record isn't just a tale of loss, but a lesson in interdependence. The societies that weathered the storm best were those that diversified, where fishing supplemented farming, where local crafts met basic needs. Their ordeal mirrors modern vulnerabilities, how quickly complex systems can falter when one thread frays, and how resilience often means rediscovering simpler, older ways of living. The abandoned markets and clipped coins of 6th century England whisper a warning across time. Prosperity is fragile when the skies turn against you. The land didn't just recover, it transformed. As villages emptied and fields lay fallow, nature began reclaiming what humanity had struggled to hold. Pollen samples from peat bogs tell a silent story of this rebirth. Layers dominated by cereal grains suddenly give way to birch and pine, pioneers of the abandoned landscape. In some regions, forests regrew so thickly that later settlers gave them names like Eildwood, old wood echoing memories of a wilderness reborn. Rivers, no longer constrained by mill dams or irrigation ditches, shifted course with newfound freedom, carving fresh channels through untended earth. At Sutton Courtenay in Oxfordshire, archaeologists found an entire Saxon watermill buried under 3 feet of silt, its wooden wheels preserved like a time capsule from the moment the floods took it. Wildlife flourished in ways unseen for generations. Deer bones in rubbish pits grow scarcer during famine years, then surge in later layers, not from hunting but from natural population booms. Wolves and bears, pushed to the fringes by expanding farmland, reclaimed lost territories. A bone fragment from a cave in Derbyshire shows the gnaw marks of a brown bear that hadn't been seen in those hills for centuries. Even the smallest creatures left their mark. Beetle casings preserved in anaerobic mud reveal a sudden diversity of species that thrived in decaying thatch and untilled soil. But the land bore scars too. In places where desperate farmers had overworked marginal soils, erosion left gullies that still gash the countryside today. At Warham Percy in Yorkshire, medieval ridges and furrows curve oddly around these ancient wounds, later generations farming around the damage like sailors avoiding submerged rocks. Some changes were more subtle. Peat cores from East Anglia show a black, famine layer of charred weeds and ash, evidence of controlled burns that got out of hand as starving communities foraged for every last nutrient. The most haunting transformations were invisible to the eye. Soil chemistry shifted where generations of manure and compost had ceased. trace elements like phosphorus and nitrogen once carefully husbanded leached away, leaving earth that would take lifetimes to replenish. In the Welsh marches, fields that had grown barley for centuries now yielded only bracken, their fertility stripped like flesh from bones. Yet from this upheaval came unexpected gifts. Rivers freed from mill races teemed with fish again, their runs no longer blocked by human obstructions. Wild apple and pear trees, their seeds spread by birds, dotted abandoned pastures, future food sources for returning generations. Even the climate played its part. As forests regrew, they absorbed carbon, possibly helping to stabilize temperatures after the volcanic chaos. The land's recovery wasn't just a return to what had been, it was the birth of something new. Today, walking these landscapes, you can still feel the echo of that transformation. Where oak roots split ancient field boundaries, where brooks murmur through forgotten mill races, the earth remembers its long winter. But it also remembers the resilience written into its very soil, a testament that even the deepest wounds can, given time, become part of the land's enduring story. The crisis didn't just starve bodies, it devoured thrones. Across England, kings who had once presided over feasts now faced subjects with hollow eyes and emptier bellies, their authority crumbling like moldering grain stores. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually a terse record of battles and successions, betrays unusual tension in its entries from this period. One Mercian king is noted simply to have gone away, a diplomatic phrasing for a ruler who likely fled rather than face the wrath of starving thanes. In Wessex, genealogies show an abrupt shortening of royal lifespans, suggesting either violent turnovers or rulers worked to death by the strain of crisis management. Power shifted not through glorious battles but through whispers in hungry halls. A Welsh triad recalls a chieftain who promised his people bread but delivered only acorns, only to vanish one night, as dew vanishes before the unjust. Archaeology confirms these oral traditions. At the royal compound of Rendlesham in Suffolk, feasting debris abruptly gives way to layers of butchered hunting dogs and horse bones, grim evidence of a court reduced to eating its own status symbols. The very trappings of authority became liabilities. Ornate gold buckles and sword hilts found melted down in hidden hoards suggest nobles liquidating wealth to buy food or loyalty. The most revealing fractures appeared in land charters, where earlier documents show kings generously granting estates to loyal followers. Mid-6th century charters increasingly record lands being reclaimed or returned, euphemisms for desperate rulers seizing back gifts to redistribute as hunger bribes. At Winchester, a single parchment lists 17 such reversals in just 5 years, each bearing witness marks from increasingly emaciated witnesses. Even the church wasn't spared. Monastery chronicles tell of abbots expelled by mobs of starving peasants who'd been promised miracles that never came. Yet amid this unraveling, new power structures emerged. Enterprising warlords with access to coastal fisheries or hidden grain caches found their influence swelling. In Kent, a previously obscure lineage called the Oisingers rose to prominence by controlling salt pans along the Thames estuary, a commodity now more precious than gold. Their rivals, the Jewess of the Upper Thames, gained followers by leading raids into less ravaged Welsh territories, returning with plundered cheese and livestock. These weren't conquests in the traditional sense, but survival strategies that accidentally built kingdoms. The crisis also exposed the fragility of inherited legitimacy. A Northumbrian saga tells of a prince who forfeited his birthright by refusing to share his last sack of barley, while a swineherd-turned-warlord named Oswiu gained followers by organizing communal hunts in abandoned royal forests. Such stories weren't just folklore. Skeletal evidence from elite burials shows a sudden decline in genetic conditions like hemochromatosis that had plagued inbred noble lines, suggesting fresh blood entering the ruling class. Perhaps the most lasting political consequence was the shift from tribute to territory. Pre-crisis kings had relied on voluntary food renders from subjects, a system that collapsed when no one had surplus to give. The solution: permanent landholdings with fixed obligations, early versions of the Hyde system, where a family's land tenure depended on providing set amounts of labor or goods, first appear in law codes from this era. It was bureaucracy born of starvation, a way to quantify loyalty when full bellies no longer could. By the time the skies cleared, the political map had redrawn itself. Petty kingdoms that had squabbled over prestige now fought for arable valleys and well-watered plains. The old Romano-British ruling class, already weakened before the disaster, largely vanished, their Latin titles giving way to Germanic terms like ealdorman and then. Even the concept of kingship changed. Where once it meant being feeder of the people, it now meant protector of the plow. The famine hadn't just toppled rulers, it had redefined what ruling meant. Starvation doesn't just empty stomachs, it uproots lives. As the cold tightened its grip on England, footpaths once trod by traders became trails of exodus, crowded with families clutching bundles of seed grain and hollow-cheeked children. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records whole villages seeking bread beyond the sea, while Irish annals tell of gaunt strangers washing ashore in leather boats, begging for land to till. These weren't conquerors with swords, they were refugees with scythes, their desperation written in the way they clutched at the first fertile soil they found. Genetic evidence reveals the scale of this human tide. DNA studies from East Anglian burial sites show a sudden influx of Scandinavian ancestry around the mid-6th century, not from Viking raids centuries later, but from earlier migrations of starving Anglo and Jute tribes fleeing frozen homelands. Skeletons in these graves often show signs of childhood malnutrition followed by robust adulthood, proof that those who survived the journey found salvation in England's slightly less ravaged south. Linguistic clues echo this movement. Old English absorbed dozens of loanwords for survival techniques from these migrants, terms like bearer, barley, and croft, small farm, words that became the backbone of a new agricultural vocabulary. The Irish Sea, once a barrier, became a highway for the desperate. Welsh chronicles describe green men arriving from Ireland, not mythical beings, but emaciated refugees whose skin had taken on a pallor from living on seaweed and wild grasses. Archaeological digs on the Lynn Peninsula uncover hastily built roundhouses with Irish-style hearths, their floors littered with oyster shells and bird bones, meals of last resort. Some migrants brought more than hunger. Isotopic analysis of teeth from these sites reveals individuals who'd survived on diets rich in dairy, suggesting they drove starving cattle before them like edible savings accounts. Not all movement was voluntary. Law codes from the period bristle with new penalties for man-stealing, revealing how slavers preyed on the vulnerable. A chilling entry in the laws of Ingenuity condemns those who sell a hungry man across the water, while Norse sagas later recalled this era as the famine time when thralls were cheap. At a mass grave in Dorset, skeletons with filed teeth, a Norse custom, lie beside locals with hands bound, tragic evidence of this dark trade. Yet amid the chaos, cultural fusion sparked unexpected resilience. In Cornwall, Celtic farmers taught Saxon newcomers how to terrace hillsides against erosion, while the Saxons introduced hardier wheat strains. Place names still bear witness to these encounters. Walton, Welsh town villages dotting Saxon regions, Saxon's Ford mark us deep in British territories. Even cooking styles merged. Carbonized remains of hearths show Celtic roundbreads being baked alongside Saxon flatbreads on the same stones. The most enduring legacy of this migration wasn't conquest, but adaptation. As geneticist David Reich notes, the 6th century saw faster genetic turnover in Britain than any period since the Ice Age. But this wasn't replacement, it was reinvention. A child's grave in Norfolk holds the proof, buried with a Saxon-style brooch but wrapped in a Celtic-patterned shroud, her bones telling a story not of invasion, but of hungry people finding common ground in shared survival. The Great Weather Crisis didn't just move populations, it remade them, forging through desperation a stronger, more diverse England from the ashes of the old. Beneath the quiet fields of modern England, the earth holds grim receipts from that long winter. At West Heslington in Yorkshire, archaeologists uncovered a plough abandoned mid-furrow, its iron share still caked with soil from the last desperate attempt at planting. Nearby lay the skeleton of its owner, a man in his 30s with teeth worn down from grinding coarse famine bread, his spine curved from years of malnutrition. This isn't just an isolated tragedy, it's a pattern repeated across dozens of excavation sites. In Norfolk, a mass grave holds 17 individuals buried hastily under a collapsed granary, their bones interlocked as if huddled together for warmth. Forensic analysis reveals rib fractures consistent with scurvy, a disease unheard of in England since the Roman occupation until this catastrophe struck. The silent testimonies go beyond human remains. At Mucking in Essex, researchers found storage pits filled not with grain, but with the charred seeds of invasive weeds, cleavers, dock, and goosefoot, plants no one would harvest except in absolute desperation. Soil samples tell their own story. Layers that should be rich with pollen from crops like wheat and barley instead show a sudden dominance of fungal spores that thrive on decaying vegetation. One particularly haunting find comes from Winchester, where a child's leather shoe was discovered still stuffed with dried moss, an improvised insulation against the unending cold. Modern science breathes life into these artifacts. Isotope analysis of teeth enamel can trace where individuals grew up versus where they died, revealing shocking migrations. A woman buried in Kent with Welsh dental signatures suggests entire families walking hundreds of miles in search of food. CT scans of bones show Harris lines, dense ridges that form when growth is interrupted by starvation, then resumes. Many 6th century skeletons have multiple lines, like tree rings marking successive famines. Perhaps the most revealing technology is strontium isotope mapping, which tracks the mineral signatures locked in tooth enamel. Studies show individuals who spent their childhoods in fertile river valleys dying in upland areas where they'd gone to forage, a silent exodus written in chemistry. At Sutton Hoo, famed for its royal treasures, less glamorous finds paint a darker picture, a cooking pot containing the remains of a stew made from hedgehog and crow, species only eaten when all else fails. Even animal bones speak volumes. In pre-crisis layers, cattle bones show animals slaughtered at prime age for meat. During the famine years, skeletons belong mostly to elderly beasts, evidence of people clinging to dairy-producing cows until the last possible moment. At West Stowe, a dog burial included a collar with a worn-down iron tag bearing scratched runes that translate to protector, likely a beloved guardian who outlived its starving family. These fragments form a mosaic of resilience and despair. A single barley seed found sprouted in a collapsed granary at Burdoswald suggests someone's futile attempt to restart life. The real revelation isn't just how people suffered, but how they adapted, switching from wheat to rye, from beef to fish, from solitary farming to communal survival. As laser scans reconstruct abandoned villages and DNA analysis traces the spread of hardier crop varieties, we're not just uncovering tragedy, we're mapping the blueprint of human ingenuity that carried England through its darkest century. The monks who kept vigil through those sunless years left behind writings that shudder with despair even now. In the margin of a psalter from Lindisfarne, a shaky hand scrawled in Latin, "The sky weeps ash and we weep with it." This wasn't poetic flourish, it was documentation. The Welsh Annals Cambriae records for the year 537 simply, "There was great death." But the most chilling account comes from the Byzantine historian Procopius, who wrote of a sun without light, a year without seasons, describing how men sat in their homes with lamps lit at midday, not knowing if it was the world ending or God's judgment. Irish monastic chronicles preserve even rawer anguish. The Annals of Ulster describe how the bread failed from the years 536 to 539, while the Annals of Innisfallen tell of nobles reduced to eating the flesh of their hounds. One scribe in Bangor added a desperate postscript to a psalm: "We have boiled the book covers for broth, and still the children wail." These weren't distant observers, they were starving men recording their own unraveling world. Secular voices echo the horror through poetry. The Old English poem, The Wanderer, though written later, carries echoes of this trauma. Where has the horse gone? Where the young warrior, where the giver of treasure? Lines that resonate with 6th century mass graves where warrior and farmer alike lie tangled. A Welsh lament attributed to the bard Taliesin speaks of a mist that chokes the morning, a frost that never thaws, while Norse skaldic verse describes the wolf sun, a dim copper disk that gave no warmth to the plough. What makes these texts so powerful is their stark contrast to earlier writings. Pre-crisis manuscripts burst with land grants, royal genealogies, and harvest records. Then suddenly blank pages. At Lichfield Cathedral, a gospel book shows 5 meticulously penned years, followed by 12 nearly empty folios marked only by shaky notes like "no barley" or "another burial." The very act of writing became a struggle. Ink recipes from the period show monks substituting soot for scarce gallnuts, resulting in ghostly grey script that seems to fade as you read. Yet within this despair glimmer moments of startling clarity. A Northumbrian monk named Eadfrith left a single perfect line amid smudged pages: "If the sun forgets us, we must remember light." In Wales, the Red Book of Hergest preserves a farmer's prayer that begins, "God who made the soil, make it remember seed." These fragments do more than document suffering. They reveal the unbroken human insistence on meaning, even when the world seemed emptied of all sense. The written word becomes our bridge across 14 centuries, carrying not just facts, but the weight of lived experience. When we read a Kentish scribe's complaint that his ink freezes before it dries, we don't just learn about temperature drops, we feel the damp chill of that scriptorium. The records are spotty, biased, often literal cries in the dark, but together they form something extraordinary, a chorus of voices whispering through time, ensuring their long winter would not be forgotten. Long after the skies cleared and the crops regrew, the terror of those sunless years lived on in stories whispered by firelight. The Norse weren't just spinning tales when they spoke of Fimbulwinter, the 3 winters without summer that heralded Ragnarök. Their sagas describe a wolf swallowing the sun, rivers freezing mid-flow, and brothers turning on each other for scraps. These weren't fantastical inventions, they were memories fossilized in myth. Icelandic manuscripts like the Vafthrudnismál preserve eerie details: how the wind bites, the world darkens, that match ice core evidence of the 636 catastrophe. Even the timing aligns. Norse genealogies place the legendary King Ivar Vidfamne's reign during this period, a ruler said to have risen to power by feeding his people when others starved. Welsh folklore carries its own scars. The Mabinogion, a collection of medieval tales, speaks of the speckled plague, a blight that withered crops and left villages silent. One story tells of a hero venturing into the underworld to retrieve a stolen cauldron of plenty, a metaphor so transparent it aches. Archaeologists digging at Dinas Imrais found charred grain pits dating to the famine years, their contents mixed with animal bones bearing knife marks. Nearby, a 6th century standing stone bears an inscription. Billy mourned the empty fields. Billy wasn't a god, but a real chieftain whose name became shorthand for loss. Irish monks transformed trauma into theology. The Liber Gabala Erin, or Book of Invasions, describes a fog so thick it crushed men's breath, while the annals of Tigernach record druids performing rituals to bind the sun's chains. These weren't mere superstitions, they were attempts to explain the unexplainable. At Clonmacnoise, a carved cross shows a sun disk blackened with soot, its rays ending in skeletal hands. Radiocarbon dating places it squarely in the famine's wake. Even the legendary King Arthur's battles against the Winter Knight in later romances may echo distant recollections of warlords fighting over dwindling supplies. The most haunting adaptations appear in children's folklore. English nursery rhymes like "Ring Around the Rosy," once thought to reference the Black Death, contain older layers of meaning. The line "Ashes, ashes" takes on grim new weight when you learn 6th century Britons used ash from burnt fields to stretch flour. A Germanic lullaby found in a 10th century manuscript warns of a hungry moon that eats the day's light, almost certainly a vestige of oral traditions about the dimmed sun. These stories did more than preserve pain, they encoded survival strategies. Scandinavian tales of larder raiding giants taught listeners to cache food in hidden places. A Welsh triad advises planting 3 seeds where one should go, a clear lesson in diversification after monocrops failed. The Irish myth of the Cailleach, a winter hag who must be tricked into releasing spring, likely originated as agricultural allegory, how to endure until the cold breaks. What makes these legends so poignant is their duality. They're both memorial and manual, mourning the lost while preparing future generations. The same volcanic ash that blotted out the sun became the grit around which cultures formed pearls of wisdom. When modern climatologists study tree rings and ice cores, they're not just reconstructing atmospheric chemistry, they're decoding the oldest warnings humanity ever wrote. The myths whisper what the data confirms. Civilizations rise and fall by the whims of the sky, but stories outlast even the longest winter. The catastrophe that gripped 6th century England wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a global pattern where nature's upheavals have rewritten human history. Take the infamous dust veil of 536, often linked to the same volcanic event that darkened England's skies. While England shivered under weakened sunlight, Byzantine historian Procopius recorded bread riots in Constantinople, and Chinese chronicles described summer frosts killing silkworms, collapsing the empire's lucrative silk trade. The parallels are chilling. Societies separated by continents yet united by shared desperation, their struggles etched in tree rings from Sweden to Siberia. But unlike England's prolonged crisis, the dust veil's worst effects lasted just 18 months, proof that duration can matter as much as intensity when testing a civilization's resilience. The Little Ice Age, centuries later, offers another mirror. Beginning around the 1300s, this climatic shift brought plummeting temperatures, failed harvests, and famines across Europe. Yet the consequences diverged starkly from 6th century England. When frost fairs sprouted on the frozen Thames, Londoners adapted with winter markets and ice skating innovations born from gradual change. The crisis of 536 struck like a hammer blow, leaving no time for adjustment. Both events reveal a cruel truth. Societies can endure slow declines, but sudden collapses breed chaos. Archaeological layers from the Little Ice Age show orderly transitions to hardier crops like rye and potatoes, while 6th century sites reveal panic, abandoned plows, cannibalized livestock, and mass graves. Perhaps the most telling comparison lies in societal responses. During the 1700s year without a summer, triggered by Indonesia's Mount Tambora, New England farmers compensated with ingenious solutions like heated greenhouses and early canned food. 6th century Britons, lacking scientific understanding, turned to spiritual appeals and myth-making. The difference underscores humanity's evolving relationship with disaster. Where pre-modern societies saw divine wrath, later generations sought earthly solutions. Yet all these crises share one haunting commonality: their capacity to expose inequality. When the Little Ice Age's famine struck, European nobles retreated to well-stocked castles while peasants starved. Similarly, 6th century mass graves hold far fewer ornate brooches or sword fittings than earlier burials, suggesting elites couldn't shield themselves from a crisis that consumed all. The thread connecting these disasters isn't just suffering, it's transformation. Just as the Black Death's labor shortages empowered medieval workers to demand better wages, England's weather catastrophe accelerated the Anglo-Saxon rise. Meanwhile, the Little Ice Age's agricultural failures spurred the Columbian Exchange as Europeans scrambled for New World crops. Each crisis forced societies to either adapt or perish, with outcomes as varied as volcanic ash carried on global winds. These historical echoes resonate painfully today. Like 6th century farmers watching unseasonable frosts, we now face rising seas and megadroughts, slow-motion disasters demanding urgent action. The past whispers a warning. Civilizations that mistake temporary stability for permanence are playing a dangerous game. Whether it's volcanic ash or carbon emissions, the lesson remains unchanged: when the environment shifts, so too must we. The bones beneath England's soil, the sagas of Fimbulwinter, the frantic marginalia of freezing monks, they're not just relics. They're snapshots of humanity's endless dance with a planet that never promised us calm. Climate has always been the silent architect of human destiny, its invisible hand toppling empires and birthing new eras while chroniclers fixated on kings and battles. Take the mighty Akkadian Empire, which ruled Mesopotamia for centuries until around 2200 BCE, when drought turned fertile plains to dust. Archaeological sites show layers of thriving cities abruptly buried under wind-blown sand, their irrigation canals choked with silt. The same pattern repeats across millennia. The collapse of the Maya during prolonged dry spells, the Norse abandonment of Greenland as the Little Ice Age froze their pastures, even the French Revolution's bred riots fueled by volcanic-induced crop failures. Weather writes history in erased civilizations and redirected migrations, its influence far more pervasive than any single warlord's ambition. What makes climate's role so profound is its ability to amplify existing vulnerabilities. The Roman Empire didn't fall solely to barbarian invasions. It cracked under the strain of prolonged droughts in North Africa, its breadbasket and erratic Nile floods that disrupted Egyptian grain shipments. Ice cores from the Alps reveal a sharp cooling period coinciding with Rome's 3rd century crisis, when inflation and unrest peaked as harvests dwindled. Similarly, the Mongol Empire's explosive expansion under Genghis Khan may owe less to bloodlust than to steppe grasslands flourishing during a rare warm, wet period. enabling unprecedented horse breeding and mobility. Even colonialism's shape was molded by climate, the search for the Northwest Passage driven by Europe's desperation to bypass Ottoman-controlled routes during the Little Ice Age's famines. Yet climate's influence extends beyond collapse. The Dutch Golden Age bloomed partly thanks to a warming period that extended growing seasons, while the spice trade boomed when monsoon shifts opened new sailing routes. The Industrial Revolution itself may trace its roots to England's coal adoption after the Little Ice Age decimated firewood supplies. These aren't coincidences but cascades, small climatic nudges that redirected human ingenuity. Today, as we uncover sunken Viking walls where glaciers retreated or traced drought lines in abandoned Anasazi cliff dwellings, we're not just studying weather. We're reading the marginalia of history, where climate scribbled notes between the lines of human deeds. The lesson for our era is clear. Just as 6th century England's survivors adapted by embracing rye over wheat or coastal foraging over farming, civilizations thrive when they read the skies as attentively as their ledgers. The ruins of Petra, its elaborate water channels now dry, and the ghost ships of the Franklin expedition, frozen in Arctic ice, stand as monuments to societies that mistook temporary climate stability for permanence. Our ancestors, lacking satellites and climate models, could be forgiven for seeing weather as the whim of gods. We have no such excuse. The volcanic winter of 536 didn't just starve bodies, it starved ignorance, forcing humanity to confront its fragility in the face of nature's indifference. That confrontation, more than any crown or conquest, shaped the world we inherited. The parallels between 6th century England's climate catastrophe and our own era are impossible to ignore, not because history repeats itself, but because humanity keeps forgetting the script. Today, as wildfires scorch continents and rising seas swallow coastlines, we face disruptions just as profound as those that toppled medieval kingdoms. The difference: we're armed with knowledge our ancestors lacked. Satellite imagery tracks melting ice sheets in real time. Climate models predict monsoon shifts decades in advance. And yet, like those monks recording the dimming sun with no power to stop it, we often treat warnings as curiosities rather than calls to action. The volcanic ash that once clouded the skies has been replaced by carbon emissions, but the consequences remain eerily similar. Crops failing at scale, mass migrations triggered by drought, and political systems buckling under the strain. What's most striking isn't the disasters themselves, but the patterns of response. 6th century societies fractured when rulers failed to adapt. Kings who hoarded grain while their people starved lost legitimacy overnight. Modern equivalents play out in corporate boardrooms and legislative chambers, where short-term profits trump long-term survival. Archaeologists sifting through famine-era trash pits find evidence of communal ovens where villages pooled their last handfuls of flour. Today's mutual aid networks during hurricanes or heatwaves echo that same instinct, proof that solidarity, not technology, may be our species' most durable innovation. Yet for every community planting climate-resistant crops or restoring wetlands as natural buffers, there are 10 more clinging to business as usual, like those anglo-saxon farmers stubbornly sowing wheat in frozen fields. The lesson buried in England's ancient soil isn't just about survival, it's about reimagining prosperity. When the crisis hit, societies that diversified thrived. Coastal villages turned to fishing, upland communities rediscovered forgotten foraging skills, and blacksmiths repurposed swords into plowshares. Today's equivalents: renewable energy microgrids, regenerative agriculture, circular economies, aren't just environmental buzzwords. They're the modern iterations of an age-old truth: resilience lies in flexibility. The 6th century's darkest irony was that the very innovations born of desperation, rye cultivation, communal land management became foundations for medieval Europe's recovery. Our challenge is to adopt such adaptations before disaster forces our hand. Perhaps the most haunting warning from the past is how quickly normalcy unravels. Tree rings show the weather shifted over months, not centuries, a blink in geological time that upended civilizations. Modern climate data reveals similar abrupt tipping points, ocean currents slowing, permafrost thawing, ice sheets calving. Unlike our ancestors, we can't blame the gods or comets. The volcanic winter was an act of nature. Our crisis is one of choice. When future archaeologists sift through our ruins, they won't find cryptic inscriptions about angry deities. They'll read oil lobby memos and defunded climate initiatives as the real prophecies of doom. Yet within this grim tableau glimmers a counter-narrative. The same ice cores that record ancient cataclysms now track humanity's capacity for course correction. The ozone hole is healing because nations phased out CFCs. Rivers once declared biologically dead now teem with fish thanks to cleanup laws. These victories, though partial, prove we're not doomed to repeat the past. The monks who chronicled England's long winter did more than document collapse. They preserved knowledge that helped rebuild. Our equivalent, satellite data guiding reforestation, AI optimizing water use, indigenous fire practices reviving ecosystems. The tools have changed, but the imperative remains. Listen to the land, learn from the lost, and plant seeds, literal and metaphorical, for a world we may not live to see, but that our descendants will inherit. Ultimately, the gap between 6th century survivors and modern society isn't one of intelligence, but imagination. They couldn't conceive of a world beyond their famine. We struggle to envision one beyond fossil fuels. Their myths spoke of winters without end. Ours whisper of coasts underwater and cities abandoned to deserts. But mythology also carries hope, the promise that spring follows even the cruelest winter. The difference this time, we're not passive witnesses to the story, we're its authors. The ash clouds have lifted, but the choices we make now will determine whether future generations remember us as the fools who ignored the warnings, or the ancestors who heeded them just in time. Even today, centuries later, historians still clash over the true nature of the catastrophe that gripped 6th century England. Was it a single catastrophic event, a volcanic eruption so massive it choked the skies for years, or a series of compounding disasters, eruptions, climate shifts, and perhaps even cosmic impacts that stacked misery upon misery? The debate isn't just academic, it shapes how we understand resilience in the face of collapse. On one side, scholars like dendrochronologist Mike Bailey point to tree rings showing a sharp, global downturn in 536, arguing for a single trigger, likely a tropical supervolcano like Ilopango. Ice core evidence seems to support this, with sulfate spikes so pronounced they dwarf even Krakatoa's signature. But other researchers, like climate historian Kyle Harper, counter that the suffering lasted too long. Over a decade of failed harvests can't be explained by one eruption alone. They point to sediment layers suggesting repeated volcanic activity in the 540s, and even comet dust traces in ice, hinting at a 1-2 punch of disasters. Then there's the question of scale. Some reconstructions based on pollen samples and settlement patterns suggest entire regions of England may have lost half their population. Mass graves like the one at Bromfield in Shropshire, where bodies were stacked like firewood, seem to confirm this grim picture, but other archaeologists caution against overstating the devastation. At West Heslington in Yorkshire, excavations reveal continuous occupation through the worst years. with evidence of careful rationing and adapted diets, wild foods like hazelnuts and crabapples supplementing meager harvests. Could the catastrophe have been patchwork, some communities collapsing while others weathered the storm? The written record adds to the confusion. Gildas, a 6th century British monk, wails about cities emptied and fields abandoned, while the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle barely mentions the crisis at all. Was it selective memory, or did some regions genuinely fare better? The most heated debates swirl around the political consequences. Traditional narratives, shaped by later sources like Bede, paint the famine as the death knell for post-Roman British kingdoms, clearing the way for Anglo-Saxon dominance. But recent genetic studies complicate this. DNA from Cambridgeshire burial sites shows no sudden population replacement. Instead, a gradual mixing of British and Saxon groups over centuries. Could the crisis have accelerated cultural exchange rather than conquest? Fragments of law codes support this. Welsh and Saxon rulers alike issued emergency decrees about shared grain stores and refugee rights, suggesting pragmatism trumped ethnic divisions when survival was at stake. What makes these unresolved questions so compelling isn't just the mystery, it's what they reveal about how history gets written. Catastrophes force societies to their limits, and those limits look different depending on who's telling the story. A king's chronicler might record a dynasty's fall, while a farmer's granddaughter remembers how her clan learned to bake acorn bread. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, a world where nature's fury collided with human fragility, where some starved while others adapted, and where the line between collapse and transformation blurred like a fog-bound horizon. These debates remind us that history is never just one story, it's a mosaic of survival strategies, half-remembered traumas, and quiet triumphs scrawled in the margins of time. Modern archaeology no longer relies solely on trowels and brushes. Today's researchers wield lasers, algorithms, and strands of ancient DNA to peel back layers of history with astonishing precision. Take LiDAR technology, which has revolutionized how we see landscapes lost to time. By firing laser pulses from aircraft and measuring their reflection, archaeologists can map terrain hidden under dense forests or beneath centuries of soil. In England's Yorkshire Wolds, LiDAR revealed a sprawling network of deserted medieval villages and forgotten field systems, their outlines etched into the earth like ghostly blueprints. These weren't just random abandonments, they formed a pattern, clustered in regions where 6th century pollen records show catastrophic crop failures. Suddenly, the historical record of mass migrations gained tangible proof, entire communities vanishing from fertile valleys and reappearing as faint geometric shadows on coastal plains. But LiDAR is just the beginning. Advances in stable isotope analysis now let scientists read human skeletons like historical diaries. By measuring ratios of elements like strontium and oxygen in tooth enamel, researchers can trace where individuals grew up versus where they died. A burial in East Anglia might hold bones with isotopic signatures matching the Scottish Highlands, evidence of desperate journeys made during famine years. Even more revealing is nitrogen isotope analysis, which detects periods of starvation in bone collagen. Skeletons from 6th century mass graves show spikes in nitrogen-15, a telltale marker of protein deprivation so severe the body began consuming its own muscle tissue. These aren't just numbers on a lab report. They're visceral records of suffering, quantifying the cost of those sunless years down to the biochemical level. Perhaps the most transformative tool is ancient DNA sequencing, where historians once debated whether the Anglo-Saxon influx was invasion or migration. Genetics now offers a nuanced answer. Analysis of cemetery remains shows no abrupt population replacement. but rather a gradual mixing with a startling twist. During the Famine century, certain genetic markers associated with lactose tolerance surged in frequency. The implication: those who could digest milk into adulthood had a survival advantage when crops failed, passing that trait to future generations. Nature's cruel calculus favored genetic adaptability as much as cultural resilience. Meanwhile, climate science has turned detective. Paleoclimatologists feed data from ice cores, tree rings, and sediment layers into supercomputers, reconstructing ancient weather patterns with pixel-perfect detail. Their models reveal how a volcanic eruption could have altered jet streams, diverting rain from Britain while drowning Scandinavia in unseasonal floods. This wasn't just local bad weather, it was a global atmospheric tantrum, its fingerprints visible in ruined olive groves around the Mediterranean and abandoned rice terraces in China. The real magic happens when these technologies converge. LiDAR maps show where villages stood, isotopes reveal where their inhabitants came from, DNA traces their biological legacies, and climate models explain why they fled. A single tooth can hint at a childhood spent in Wales, an adolescence in Normandy, and a famine-weakened end in Kent, all while carrying genes that would shape medieval England's future. What emerges isn't just a sharper picture of the past, but a humbling reminder: history isn't set in stone. Every new tool rewrites old assumptions, turning yesterday's mysteries into today's revelations. The 6th century survivors left no climate models or genetic reports, just bones, stories, and landscapes whispering secrets we're finally learning to hear. The catastrophe didn't just scar the land, it rewrote England's cultural DNA, embedding itself in art, memory, and even the way people worked the earth for centuries. One of the most haunting legacies lies in the medieval doom paintings that began appearing in churches long after the skies cleared. These vivid frescoes depicted the Last Judgment with an eerie specificity. Corpses rising from cracked soil, skeletal figures clutching withered sheaves of grain. Art historians now recognize these as coded references to the famine, a trauma so profound it fused with religious imagery. At St. Mary's in Chalgrove, a 14th century mural shows Christ surrounded not by angels, but by peasants holding empty bowls, a detail absent in earlier depictions, suggesting the disaster's shadow stretched far beyond living memory. Literature, too, bore its mark. The Old English poem, The Seafarer, with its lines about frost-bound fields and fruitless earth, echoes 6th century descriptions verbatim. Even Beowulf's famous Mead Hall, Heorot, a sanctuary against the outside dark, reads differently when you know it was composed during the famine's aftermath. The epic's obsession with feasting and food hoarding takes on new weight, as if the poet were exercising collective hunger through verse. More subtly, land charters from the period introduced a new clause: except in time of great hunger, allowing lords to temporarily revoke grazing rights during shortages, a legal innovation born of hard experience. The crisis reshaped England's physical landscape just as deeply. Open field farming, where villagers pooled strips of land, became widespread after the famine, replacing isolated homesteads. This wasn't just practical, it was psychological. A system designed to spread risk so no family starved alone. Ridge and furrow patterns still visible in pastures today trace their origins to post-famine plowing techniques, angled to drain waterlogged fields that had betrayed a generation. Even folklore adapted. The figure of the Green Man, a face sprouting leaves, evolved from pre-Christian spirits into a symbol of resilience, his foliage promising that life could return after barrenness. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was linguistic. The word hunger itself gained new companions in Old English. Famine, from Latin fames, entered common usage, while H. Lofford Lord literally meant loaf warden, a title born from the duty to safeguard bread stores. Proverbs like "shared sorrow is half sorrow" first appear in texts from this era, capturing the communal ethos that emerged from desperation. Even children's games preserved the trauma. The rhyme "Ring Around the Rosie," with its ashes and falling down, likely originated as a grim memory of plague years that followed crop failures. The Catastrophe's fingerprints linger in unexpected places. Herbal remedies from the period show a surge in recipes for famine bread, substitutes using fern roots and bark, passed down as folk medicine long after necessity faded. Calendar customs shifted. 2 May Day celebrations grew more frenetic, as if each spring's return needed vigorous affirmation. Most tellingly, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually a dry record of battles and successions, deviates just once to note a king's death from eating too much, a dark joke that only makes sense in a world where gluttony was the rarest of sins. These adaptations reveal a profound truth. Culture isn't just what we create, it's what we salvage from wreckage. The same event that erased so much also compelled new forms of expression, new ways of remembering. When a Suffolk farmer today trims hedgerows to precise heights, or a Yorkshire baker shapes loaves with a cross cut to "let the devil out," they're unwitting heirs to a catastrophe that taught England how fragile and how stubborn human tradition can be. The weather event didn't just change history, it seeped into the marrow of how people saw their world, turning survival into stories and stories into stones that still stand. 14 centuries may separate us from that endless winter, but its lessons press against the present with startling urgency. The catastrophe that gripped 6th century England was more than a historical tragedy. It was a stress test for civilization itself, revealing both the brittle fragility of human systems and the astonishing creativity of communities under siege. The numbers alone are staggering. Tree rings show growth stunted for 15 years. Mass graves hint at mortality rates exceeding 50% in some regions, and pollen records trace the near erasure of cultivated crops from the landscape. Yet within this devastation lies a paradox. The same event that nearly erased early England also forged the adaptive strategies that allowed its culture to endure. What resonates across the centuries isn't just the scale of suffering, but the blueprint of resilience etched into the response. When traditional farming collapsed, survivors turned to the sea, transforming fishing from a supplement to a lifeline. Where wheat and barley failed, rye, once considered a lesser grain, became the cornerstone of survival agriculture. Law codes shifted from glorifying warriors to rewarding those who could store grain or mend plows. Even spiritual life adapted, blending Christian and pagan rituals into a pragmatic theology of survival. These weren't random acts of desperation, but conscious innovations, proof that necessity doesn't just mother invention, it midwives societal transformation. The parallels to our own era are impossible to ignore. Like 6th century Britons staring at ash-dimmed skies, we now face environmental shifts that challenge the foundations of our systems. Their volcanic winter mirrors our climate crisis. Their collapsed trade networks echo our fragile global supply chains, but crucial differences emerge. Where they lacked scientific understanding, we have climate models predicting drought patterns decades in advance. Where they blamed gods or comets, we can pinpoint carbon emissions and policy failures. Most importantly, unlike our ancestors, we're not helpless witnesses to the unfolding drama. We're active participants with agency to alter the ending. This is where history's whisper grows urgent. The survivors of England's long winter left us more than cautionary tales. They bequeathed a toolkit for endurance. Their experience teaches that resilience isn't about stubbornly preserving the status quo, but about flexible reinvention. When their fields froze, they foraged forests. When trade collapsed, they relearned self-sufficiency. When old gods fell silent, they found new ways to hope. Our challenge is to apply that same adaptive courage, not in hindsight but in foresight. To invest in drought-resistant crops before famine strikes, to diversify energy sources before grids fail, to strengthen social bonds before crises fracture them. The final lesson may be the hardest to hear. Civilizations thrive not by conquering nature, but by respecting its rhythms. Those 6th century farmers knew their existence hung by threads. A late frost, a dry spring, a single season's miscalculation could unravel generations of work. Modernity's illusion of control has dulled that visceral awareness, but the planet's shifting climate is reteaching the old truth. We are not masters of this world, but participants in its delicate balance. The sunless years that nearly destroyed early England weren't an anomaly. They were a reminder that stability is the exception, not the rule, in Earth's long story. As we stand at our own crossroads, the past offers neither doom nor reassurance, only perspective. The bones beneath English soil, the tree rings recording their suffering, the myths spun from their trauma, all whisper the same question across the centuries. Will we learn from the long winter, or will we force future generations to relive it? The answer won't be written in chronicles or buried in ruins, but in the choices we make today to listen, to adapt, and above all, to remember that civilizations, like crops, grow strongest when rooted in humility. This journey through England's forgotten climate catastrophe isn't just history, it's a conversation starter. Did any of these survival stories surprise you? Maybe you've noticed eerie parallels to modern climate challenges, or perhaps your own family has passed down tales of resilience from hard times. Drop a comment below. Have you ever heard older generations talk about the year summer never came or the winter that wouldn't end? Your local folklore might hold hidden clues to how communities in your area weathered disasters long before weather apps or emergency alerts. For those hungry to dig deeper, I've packed the description with hand-picked resources from interactive climate timelines showing how volcanic eruptions ripple across centuries, to digital archives of medieval farming manuals that survived the famine. There's even a link to a groundbreaking study where scientists recreated 6th century famine bread using ancient recipes. Spoiler: it's as tough as you'd imagine. And if you're fascinated by how societies collapse and rebuild, don't miss the reading list featuring works by historians who have uncovered similar climate crises from the Maya world to the Khmer Empire. But here's where you come in. History isn't just something we consume, it's something we piece together. Have you stumbled upon an old diary mentioning strange weather, or does your hometown have a peculiar tradition that might trace back to survival strategies? Share those fragments below. Sometimes the smallest detail, like a grandmother's rhyme about storing nuts or a local festival honoring fishermen, can reveal how cultures encode survival wisdom. Let's crowdsource the echoes of humanity's oldest battle, adapting when the world changes beneath our feet. The comments aren't just a space for reactions, they're our collective field notes for understanding how civilizations endure. So grab your metaphorical trowel or just your keyboard, and let's keep unearthing these stories together. Who knows, the memory you share today might help someone else weather tomorrow's storm.